The Cessna 172's engine coughed once, twice, then roared back to life as Sarah Chen gripped the yoke with white knuckles. At 10,000 feet above the rolling hills of Northern California, the single-engine aircraft felt as fragile as a paper airplane caught in a hurricane. But it wasn't the engine that made her heart pound against her ribs. It was the blood trickling from her flight instructor's nose as he slumped unconscious in the seat beside her. "Marcus? Marcus!" Her voice cracked as she shook his shoulder. The aircraft lurching slightly to the left before she corrected with desperate pressure on the rudder pedals. The radio crackled with static, the frequency busy with other pilots checking in with Oakland Center, their voices calm and professional, everything hers wasn't. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. She'd been flying for exactly 47 hours and 23 minutes of logged flight time. Not enough to handle an emergency landing. Definitely not enough to handle this. The afternoon sun blazed through the windscreen, turning the cockpit into a furnace despite the altitude. Sweat stung her eyes as she fumbled for the emergency checklist. Clipped to the side panel, her hands trembling so violently she could barely turn the laminated pages. Engine failure, no. The engine was still running. Electrical fire, no smoke. Medical emergency, there it was. But the checklist assumed she was dealing with a passenger, not the only other person on board who actually knew how to land this machine. Marcus Holloway had been flying for 32 years. He'd survived 2 forced landings, a midter collision that made the local news, and countless students who'd tried their best to kill him in creative ways. 20 minutes ago, he'd been patiently explaining the intricacies of radio navigation, his weathered hands steady on the controls as he demonstrated a perfect steep turn. Now his breathing was shallow, his face pale except for the crimson trail from his nostril. The GPS showed they were 43 miles northeast of Sacramento Executive Airport, their planned destination. Sarah had never landed there alone. Hell, she'd never landed anywhere alone. Every landing in her logbook had Marcus's steady presence beside her, his calm voice talking her through the approach, his hands ready to take control if things went wrong. Things had definitely gone wrong. The radio burst with a transmission from a Southwest Airlines pilot reporting smooth ride conditions at flight level 380. Sarah pressed the push-to-talk button on her yoke, her thumbs slick with perspiration. Oakland Center, Cessna 739ER, requesting immediate vectors to nearest airport, medical emergency on board. The response came quickly, professionally. Cessna 739ER, Oakland Center, roger your emergency. State souls on board and nature of medical emergency. 2 souls on board. My flight instructor is unconscious, bleeding from the nose. I'm a student pilot with 47 hours. The admission tasted like copper in her mouth, like failure and terror mixed together. A pause. Then, Cessna 739ER. Understand you're a student pilot with unconscious instructor. Confirm you are pilot in command. Pilot in command. The words hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready for any of this. Affirmative, she heard herself say. Interesting, Captain Rodriguez said, but didn't elaborate. How many hours do you have, Miss Chen? 47 hours total. This was going to be my first landing at Sacramento Executive. Well, you can mark it down as a successful one. He glanced over at the ambulance where paramedics were loading Marcus onto a gurney. They're taking him to UC Davis Medical Center. It's about 20 minutes from here. Excellent trauma and neurology departments. Neurology. The word hit Sarah with a fresh wave of worry. Whatever had happened to Marcus wasn't just a simple fainting spell. It was something serious enough to require neurological evaluation. Can I go with him? She asked. I don't see why not, but first we need to secure your aircraft and complete some paperwork. The FAA will want a report on this incident. And the NTSB might get involved depending on what caused your instructor's medical emergency. The NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board. Sarah knew them as the agency that investigated aircraft accidents, the people who showed up when planes crashed and pilots died. The thought that they might investigate this flight made her knees weak. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Captain Rodriguez's expression softened. "Miss Chen, you just landed an aircraft safely after your instructor became incapacitated. You declared an emergency, followed a TC instructions, and got both of you on the ground in one piece. From where I'm standing, you did everything right." But even as he said it, Sarah could see questions in his eyes. Questions about why they'd climbed to 10,000 feet, about Marcus's medical history, about whether this was truly an unpredictable medical emergency or something else entirely. The ambulance pulled away from the aircraft, its lights flashing but siren silent. Marcus was gone, on his way to a hospital where doctors would try to figure out what had gone wrong at altitude. Sarah watched until the ambulance disappeared behind a row of hangars, feeling suddenly alone despite being surrounded by emergency personnel. "Let's get your aircraft towed to a hangar," Captain Rodriguez said. "Then we can take care of the paperwork and get you to the hospital." As a tow bar was attached to the Cessna's nosewheel, Sarah realized she was looking at the aircraft differently. Now, an hour ago, it had been a training tool, a machine she was learning to master under Marcus's patient guidance. Now it was evidence in whatever investigation would follow, a piece of the puzzle that had led to her instructor's collapse at 10,000 feet. The afternoon sun beat down on the tarmac as the aircraft was towed toward a nearby hangar, and Sarah found herself wondering if she'd ever feel comfortable in a cockpit again. She'd proven she could handle an emergency, but at what cost? And what if there was something about that flight, something about climbing to 10,000 feet, that had caused Marcus's medical crisis? As they walked toward the operations building, Captain Rodriguez's radio crackled with traffic from other aircraft, the normal flow of aviation continuing around them. But for Sarah, nothing felt normal anymore. She was a student pilot who'd been forced to become pilot in command under the worst possible circumstances, and she had no idea what that would mean for her future in aviation. Inside the air-conditioned operations building, she sat in a plastic chair and stared at a wall covered with aviation charts and weather forecasts, trying to process what had just happened. In the space of 30 minutes, she'd gone from student to emergency pilot to potential witness in an NTSB investigation. It was more than her mind could handle, and she found herself focusing on small details, the hum of the air conditioning, the taste of coffee someone had brought her, the way her hands had finally stopped shaking. "Miss Chen?" Captain Rodriguez had returned with a stack of forms. "I hate to do this while you're still processing everything, but I need to get your statement while the details are fresh in your memory." Sarah nodded, though she wondered if the details would ever not be fresh in her memory. Some experiences burned themselves so deeply into your consciousness that you could recall them with perfect clarity years later. She had a feeling this would be one of those experiences. UC Davis Medical Center rose from the Sacramento suburbs like a monument to modern medicine, its glass and steel towers reflecting the late afternoon sun. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of Captain Rodriguez's airport vehicle, watching the hospital grow larger as they approached, and tried not to think about what the doctors might have found. The emergency room was a controlled chaos of activity, nurses moving between patient rooms, doctors conferring over charts, the electronic beeping of medical equipment creating a constant background symphony. At the reception desk, Sarah gave Marcus's name and explained their relationship, feeling oddly inadequate when asked if she was family. "I'm his student pilot," she said, which seemed to explain nothing and everything at the same time. Dr. Sarah Patel, the attending neurologist, found them in the waiting room 45 minutes later. She was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in her early 30s. with the kind of focused intensity that came from dealing with brain injuries and neurological emergencies. "Mr. Holloway is stable," she said, settling into a chair across from Sarah and Captain Rodriguez. "He's conscious now, but confused and disoriented. We've done a CT scan and some blood work, and we're waiting on the results. What do you think happened?" Sarah asked. Dr. Patel hesitated, the kind of pause that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "It's too early to say definitively, but his symptoms are consistent with several possibilities. The sudden onset of headache followed by loss of consciousness and epistaxis nosebleed could indicate anything from a severe migraine to a more serious neurological event." "Could altitude have been a factor?" Captain Rodriguez asked. "Possibly. We were at 10,000 feet when it happened," Sarah added. Dr. Patel's expression became more interested. "That's significant. At 10,000 feet, you're dealing with reduced atmospheric pressure and lower oxygen partial pressure. For most healthy people, that's not a problem. But if Mr. Holloway had an underlying condition, a patent foramen ovale, for instance, or early signs of cerebrovascular disease, the altitude could have been a contributing factor." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "You're saying the altitude might have caused this?" "I'm saying it could have been a contributing factor. But let me be clear, if Mr. Holloway had an underlying condition that made him susceptible to altitude-related problems, it would have manifested eventually. Better that it happened with an experienced student pilot who could handle the emergency than over mountainous terrain or at night." Captain Rodriguez leaned forward. "Doctor, we need to understand whether this was a completely unpredictable medical event or if there were warning signs that might have been missed. I understand your concern, especially from an aviation safety perspective. Right now, I can tell you that Mr. Holloway's medical records show no history of neurological problems, no complaints of headaches or other symptoms that would have suggested an underlying condition, but we're still evaluating." A nurse appeared at Dr. Patel's side, handing her a tablet with what appeared to be test results. The doctor's expression remained neutral as she reviewed the data, but Sarah thought she detected a slight frown. "I need to examine Mr. Holloway again," Dr. Patel said, standing. "Can I ask you to wait here for a bit longer? I should have more information soon." After she left, Sarah and Captain Rodriguez sat in silence, surrounded by the ambient noise of the emergency room. Sarah found herself watching the other families waiting for news about their loved ones, wondering if they felt the same mixture of fear and helplessness that was eating at her stomach. "Captain Rodriguez," she said finally, "what happens now? I mean, with the investigation and everything?" "Well, the FAA will want a detailed report about the incident. Since there was no damage to the aircraft and no injuries other than Mr. Holloway's medical emergency, it's not likely to be a major investigation. But they'll want to understand the sequence of events, especially the decision to climb to 10,000 feet. Are you saying I might be in trouble?" Captain Rodriguez turned to face her fully. "Miss Chen, let me be very clear about something. You handled an extremely difficult situation with skill and judgment. You declared an emergency, followed ATC instructions, and landed safely at an unfamiliar airport. Any pilot would be proud of what you accomplished today. But the FAA will want to understand why a routine training flight involved a climb to 10,000 feet, especially if that altitude contributed to your instructor's medical emergency. They'll look at whether proper procedures were followed, whether the flight was conducted within the parameters of normal training," Sarah thought. Back to the moment when Marcus had requested the climb to 10,000 feet. It had seemed like a reasonable training exercise at the time. Learning how the aircraft performed at higher altitudes was part of becoming a competent pilot. But now, with Marcus in a hospital bed and doctors talking about altitude-related medical events, that decision felt ominous. "He said he wanted me to know how long it takes to climb to altitude for cross-country flying through mountains," she said. "That's a legitimate training objective," Captain Rodriguez acknowledged. But 10,000 feet is also where oxygen requirements start to become a factor, especially for extended periods. FAA regulations require supplemental oxygen for flights above 12,500 feet during the day. But some people are affected by hypoxia lower altitudes. Hypoxia. Sarah had learned about it during her training, the condition that occurred when the body didn't get enough oxygen. The symptoms included confusion, poor judgment, and loss of consciousness. But Marcus hadn't shown any signs of hypoxia. His collapse had been sudden, violent, accompanied by bleeding that suggested something more serious than simple oxygen deprivation. Dr. Patel returned 20 minutes later, her expression more grave than before. She sat down across from them and folded her hands in her lap, the gesture of someone preparing to deliver difficult news. Mr. Holloway's CT scan shows evidence of a small subarachnoid hemorrhage, she said. That's bleeding in the space around the brain, usually caused by a ruptured blood vessel. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Is he going to be okay? The bleeding appears to have stopped, and the amount is relatively small. We're admitting him to the neurological intensive care unit for observation, but his prognosis is cautiously optimistic. The confusion and disorientation should improve over the next few days. Could the altitude have caused this? Captain Rodriguez asked. Dr. Patel nodded slowly. A subarachnoid hemorrhage can be triggered by sudden changes in blood pressure or intracranial pressure. The reduced atmospheric pressure at altitude, combined with the stress of flying, could potentially have been the triggering event for someone with a pre-existing weakness in a blood vessel. So the flight to 10,000 feet might have caused this. It's possible. Without the altitude exposure, the rupture might have occurred later, or under different circumstances, or possibly not at all. But I want to emphasize that this appears to have been an underlying condition waiting to manifest. Mr. Holloway likely had a small aneurysm or arteriovenous malformation that he was unaware of. Sarah stared at her hands, trying to process the implications. If the climb to 10,000 feet had triggered Marcus's brain hemorrhage, then she was partly responsible for what had happened to him. The decision to climb had been his, but she'd been the one at the controls when they'd reached that altitude. Can I see him? She asked. Dr. Patel hesitated. He's still quite confused and may not recognize you. But if you'd like to look in on him briefly, I think that would be okay. The neurological IQ was a temple of technology, filled with monitors and machines that beeped and hummed with electronic vigilance. Marcus lay in bed number 7, his head elevated and multiple leads attached to his chest and scalp. His eyes were open, but they tracked randomly around the room without focusing on anything in particular. Marcus? Sarah said softly, standing beside his bed. He turned toward her voice, his eyes making contact with hers for a moment before drifting away. Again. Flying, he said, his voice thick and uncertain. We were flying. Yes, we were flying. We landed safely. You're in the hospital now. 10,000 feet, he said, and for a moment his eyes focused on her with something like recognition. Too high. Shouldn't have gone so high. Sarah felt her heart stop. Was he remembering what had happened? Did he realize that the altitude had contributed to his condition? Marcus, do you remember asking me to climb to 10,000 feet? But his eyes had already drifted away again, his attention captured by something only he could see. Flying, he repeated, but the word was distant now, disconnected from any meaningful context. As Sarah left the ICU, she couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus's brief moment of clarity had been an accusation. Too high, shouldn't have gone so high. Did he blame her for following his instructions? Did he realize that their training flight had turned into the medical emergency that might end his flying career? Walking back through the hospital corridors toward the waiting room, Sarah realized that her life as a pilot might be ending before it had really begun. Even if the FAA investigation cleared her of wrongdoing, Even if she was never found to be at fault, how could she ever sit in a cockpit again without wondering if her decisions might hurt someone else? The weight of being pilot in command, she was learning, didn't end when you shut down the engine. 3 days after the emergency landing at Sacramento Executive, Sarah sat in a sterile conference room at the FAA's Oakland Flight Standards District office, staring at a digital voice recorder that seemed to weigh more than the aircraft she'd landed. Across the table from her sat Inspector Janet Walsh, a woman in her 50s whose gray hair and no-nonsense demeanor suggested decades of dealing with aviation incidents that ranged from pilot error to mechanical failure to acts of God that defied easy categorization. "Miss Chen, I want to start by saying that preliminary reports indicate you handled this emergency with exceptional skill," Inspector Walsh began, her voice carrying the neutral tone of someone trained to deliver both praise and criticism without emotional inflection. "However, we need to understand the complete sequence of events that led to your instructor's medical emergency." Sarah had spent the past 3 days replaying every moment of the flight, analyzing every decision and control input with the obsessive attention to detail that Marcus had taught her to apply to all aspects of aviation. But sitting in this government office with the weight of an official investigation bearing down on her, every memory felt suspect, every decision questionable. "The flight was planned as routine training," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Cross-country navigation practice with an approach to Sacramento Executive. Nothing unusual about the planning or pre-flight." Inspector Walsh consulted her notes. "According to your flight plan, you were planning to cruise at 5,500 feet. But ATC records show you climbed to 10,000 feet, approximately 30 minutes before declaring the emergency. Can you explain that decision?" There it was, the question Sarah had been dreading since Marcus's collapse. The climb to 10,000 feet had been his idea, his decision, but she'd been the one at the controls. In the eyes of the FAA, the pilot in command bore ultimate responsibility for the conduct of the flight. Mr. Holloway requested the climb to 10,000 feet for training purposes. He wanted me to experience how the aircraft performed at that altitude, and to understand the time required to climb there for potential future cross-country flights through mountainous terrain. And you felt comfortable with that decision? Sarah hesitated. The honest answer was that she'd felt excited about the climb, eager to experience flight at an altitude she'd never reached before. But excitement wasn't the same as comfort, and the difference between the two might be crucial too. The investigation. "I was confident in my ability to handle the aircraft at that altitude," she said finally. "Mr. Holloway has always expanded my training envelope gradually, introducing new challenges when he felt I was ready for them." Inspector Walsh made notes on her tablet. "Tell me about Mr. Holloway's behavior before and during the climb. Did he show any signs of distress or discomfort?" "None at all. He was completely normal, asking me to track VOR radials, discussing navigation techniques, explaining the practical applications of what we were practicing. The change came suddenly, without any warning." "Describe the change." Sarah closed her eyes, forcing herself to relive those terrifying moments. "He was looking out at the mountains, talking about how beautiful the view was. Then he put his hand to his forehead and said he had a sudden headache. His breathing became rapid and shallow, and then the bleeding started from his nose. Within seconds, he was unconscious." "How long had you been at 10,000 feet when this occurred?" "Maybe 5 minutes. We just leveled off and were starting to work on radio navigation." Inspector Walsh leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with the kind of attention that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Miss Chen, I've reviewed your training records. You're considered an above-average student pilot with good judgment and solid basic skills. Your instructors consistently rate you as safe and competent." "Thank you," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure if she was being complimented or set up for criticism. However, This incident raises some questions about training procedures and safety protocols. Specifically, whether it's appropriate to expose student pilots to altitudes where hypoxia and other altitude-related medical issues become factors. Are you saying the training was inappropriate? I'm saying that's one of the things we need to determine. The medical evidence suggests that Mr. Holloway's condition was triggered or exacerbated by the altitude exposure. If that's the case, we need to understand whether proper safety considerations were in place. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. If the FAA determined that the flight had been conducted outside the bounds of safe training practices, it could affect not just her future as a pilot, but Marcus's career as an instructor. Golden Gate Aviation could face sanctions, other students could be affected, and the ripple effects could be enormous. Inspector Walsh, Mr. Holloway, has trained hundreds of students over 30 years without a single serious incident. His safety record is impeccable. I understand that, and it's part of what makes this case so unusual. Experienced instructors don't typically make decisions that put their students at unnecessary risk. That's why we need to understand the complete context of this flight. A knock on the conference room door interrupted the interview. Inspector Walsh answered it, speaking in low tones with someone Sarah couldn't see. When she returned to the table, her expression had changed subtly, not more stern, exactly, but more focused. Miss Chen, I've just received some additional information that might be relevant to our investigation. Are you aware that Mr. Holloway has a family history of stroke and cardiovascular disease? Sarah's heart sank. No, I wasn't aware of that. He never mentioned any medical issues. According to his medical records, his father died of a stroke at age 58, and his mother has a history of high blood pressure and cardiovascular problems. Mr. Holloway himself was recently prescribed medication for elevated blood pressure. Though he was cleared for flight instruction by his aviation medical examiner just 6 months ago, the pieces of a puzzle Sarah didn't want to solve were falling into place. Marcus had known about his family medical history, had been dealing with blood pressure issues, and had still decided to climb to 10,000 feet on a routine training flight. Why would he take that risk? Inspector Walsh, if Mr. Holloway knew about these medical factors, why would he request the climb to altitude? That's exactly what we're trying to understand. One possibility is that he didn't fully appreciate the risks. Another is that he felt the training value outweighed the potential dangers. Or there might have been some other factor we haven't identified yet. Inspector Walsh turned off the digital recorder and closed her tablet. Miss Chen, I want you to understand that this investigation isn't about assigning blame. It's about understanding what happened so we can prevent similar incidents in the future. Your actions during the emergency were exemplary, and that's not in question. But we need to determine whether this was an unforeseeable medical emergency or whether there were risk factors that should have been recognized and addressed. Depending on our findings, there might be changes to training protocols, medical certification requirements, or instructor guidelines. As Sarah left the FAA office, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She'd thought the hardest part was landing the aircraft safely with an unconscious instructor. But that had been just the beginning. Now she was part of an investigation that could change how flight training was conducted, could affect the careers of people she respected, and could determine whether she'd ever feel comfortable in a cockpit. Again, the drive back to Palo Alto took her past Sacramento Executive Airport, where she could see aircraft in the pattern practicing the same kind of approaches she'd been working on when her world had changed. Normal training flights with instructors and students working together to build skills and confidence in the familiar rhythm of aviation education. But for Sarah, that rhythm had been broken. She was no longer just a student pilot learning to fly. She was a witness in an investigation, a data point in a safety analysis, a person whose decisions at 10,000 feet had contributed to another human being's hospitalization. As she pulled into her apartment complex, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus's name, and for a moment, her heart stopped. Then she realized it was probably someone from the hospital calling from his phone. "Hello? Sarah? It's Marcus." His voice was weak but clear, more lucid than it had been in the IQ 3 days earlier. "Marcus, how are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck, but the doctors say I'm improving." "Sarah, I need to talk to you about what happened. The doctors said you should rest. I remember pieces of it now. I remember asking you to climb to 10,000 feet. I remember the headache starting, and I remember you on the radio, declaring the emergency." His voice carried a weight that made her stomach clench. "Sarah, I'm so sorry I put you in that situation. Don't apologize. You couldn't control what happened. Maybe not. But I could have controlled the decision to climb to altitude. I knew about my blood pressure, knew about my family history. I should have been more cautious." Sarah sat in her car in the parking lot, staring at the dashboard and trying to process what Marcus was telling her. "Are you saying you think the altitude caused what happened to you?" "The doctors think it was a contributing factor. A small aneurysm that might have stayed stable at sea level, but ruptured under the stress of altitude." He paused, and she could hear hospital noises in the background, monitors beeping, nurses talking, the constant activity of medical care. "Sarah, I need you to know that what happened wasn't your fault. I made the decision to climb. You were just following instructions, but I was pilot in command. The FAA says ultimate responsibility rests with me." "The FAA is wrong," Marcus said. And for a moment his voice carried some of its old strength. "You were a student pilot following the instructions of your flight instructor. No student pilot should be expected to overrule their instructor's training decisions based on medical knowledge they don't possess." After the call ended, Sarah sat in her car for a long time, watching other residents of her apartment complex come and go about their normal lives. People with jobs that didn't involve life and death decisions at 10,000 feet. People whose mistakes didn't end up in FAA incident reports or hospital intensive care units. She thought about Marcus lying in his hospital bed, dealing with the physical and professional consequences of a decision that had seemed routine just 4 days ago. She thought about Inspector Walsh and her investigation, trying to determine whether proper procedures had been followed and appropriate risks assessed. And she thought about herself, a student pilot who'd wanted nothing more than to learn to fly, and had instead become the center of a case study in aviation safety. Phone in her apartment was ringing when she walked through the door. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Is this Sarah Chen?" The voice was professional, authoritative. "Yes. This is Tom Morrison from Channel 7 News. We're doing a story about the emergency landing at Sacramento Executive Airport, and we'd like to interview you about your experience." Sarah's heart sank. The media. She should have known this was coming. Student pilot saves unconscious instructor was exactly the kind of feel-good aviation story that news outlets loved. "I'm sorry, but I can't comment while there's an ongoing investigation." "Miss Chen, we understand this must have been a terrifying experience. Our viewers would love to hear about how you overcame your fear and successfully landed the aircraft. I really can't discuss it. Just a few minutes on camera. We could meet you at the airport. Maybe do some shots of you with the aircraft you flew." Sarah hung up the phone, her hands shaking. The last thing she needed was media attention turning her emergency landing into a heroic narrative that ignored the complex questions about training, safety, and medical certification that the FAA was investigating. But as she looked out her apartment window at the evening sky, where aircraft were arriving and departing from nearby airports in the normal rhythm of aviation, she realized that the story was going to be told with or without her cooperation. And once it became public, her life as a private individual dealing with a difficult situation would be over. She was about to become the student pilot who saved her instructor's life, whether she wanted that role or not. The story broke on the Thursday evening news with the kind of dramatic music and urgent graphics that television producers reserve for natural disasters and political scandals. Sarah watched from her living room couch as Channel 7's lead anchor introduced the segment with practiced gravitas. Tonight, an incredible story of courage in the sky, as a student pilot with less than 50 hours of experience lands an aircraft safely after her instructor suffers a medical emergency at 10,000 feet. The report that followed was everything Sarah had feared it would be. Dramatic footage of Sacramento Executive Airport, interviews with witnesses who described seeing the emergency vehicle surrounding her aircraft, and breathless narration that turned her desperate struggle to survive into a feel-good story of triumph over adversity. 26-year-old Sarah Chen was just practicing routine navigation when her world changed forever. The reporter intoned over stock footage of small aircraft in flight. With her instructor unconscious and bleeding, she took control of the aircraft and successfully landed at an unfamiliar airport, saving both their lives. They'd interviewed Captain Rodriguez, who was diplomatically positive about her performance, while avoiding any mention of the ongoing FAA investigation. They'd spoken to other pilots at Golden Gate Aviation, who praised her training and determination. But they hadn't spoken to anyone who understood the complex questions about training protocols and medical certification that the incident had raised. Her phone started ringing before the report was finished. The first call was from her mother, who'd seen the story and was simultaneously proud and terrified. Then came calls from friends, co-workers, and people she barely remembered from college who'd somehow tracked down her number. By the time she turned off her phone an hour later, she'd received 17 calls and 43 text messages. The next morning brought a new level of attention. The story had been picked up by aviation websites and pilot forums, where it generated hundreds of comments from pilots analyzing every aspect of her performance. Most were supportive, praising her decision-making and emergency handling skills. But others raised uncomfortable questions. What was a 47-hour student doing at 10,000 feet? Wrote one commenter. Sounds like the instructor was pushing the envelope beyond appropriate training parameters. Great job by the student pilot, wrote another. But this incident highlights problems with CFI medical certification. Should instructors with known cardiovascular risk factors be taking students to altitude? Sarah read the comments with growing dread, realizing that the online aviation community was conducting its own investigation in parallel with the FAA's official inquiry. Every detail of the flight was being dissected by pilots with decades of experience, many of whom were reaching conclusions that called into question either her judgment or Marcus's decision-making. The worst part was that some of their criticisms echoed her own doubts. Should she have questioned Marcus's decision to climb to 10,000 feet? Should she have recognized that they were entering an altitude regime where medical emergencies became more likely? As a student pilot, was she qualified to make those assessments? Her phone rang again, and this time the caller ID showed the number for Golden Gate Aviation. Sarah hesitated before answering, unsure whether she was ready to face whatever conversation awaited her. "Sarah, it's Beth Martinez." Beth was the school's owner and chief pilot, a woman in her 60s who'd built Golden Gate Aviation from a single aircraft and a desk in a trailer into one of the Bay Area's most respected flight training operations. "Hi, Beth. I wanted to check on how you're holding up with all this attention. I know it can't be easy." Sarah appreciated the concern, but she could hear something else in Beth's voice, a tension that suggested this wasn't just a social call. "I'm managing. It's been a little overwhelming." "I can imagine. Sarah, I need to talk to you about something important. Can you come in this afternoon?" 2 hours later, Sarah sat in Beth's office, surrounded by aviation memorabilia and framed certificates that documented decades of safe flight training. Beth had poured coffee for both of them, but neither cup had been touched as they worked. Through the difficult conversation that Sarah had known was coming. "The FAA called this morning," Beth said without preamble. "They're expanding their investigation to include a review of our training protocols and safety procedures." Sarah's stomach dropped because of what happened with Marcus, partly, but also because of the media attention and the questions being raised online about whether the flight was conducted within appropriate training parameters. Beth leaned back in her chair, looking older than her 62 years. "Sarah, I want you to know that this school stands behind both you and Marcus. What happened was an unforeseeable medical emergency, and you handled it with exceptional skill. But the FAA is going to scrutinize everything about that flight. They'll look at the lesson plan, the decision to climb to altitude, Marcus's medical history, and our policies regarding high-altitude training. If they find deficiencies in our procedures, it could affect our operating certificate." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Golden Gate Aviation employed 12 flight instructors and served over 200 students. If the school lost its operating certificate or faced significant sanctions, all of those people would be affected. Marcus's medical emergency had started a chain reaction that could destroy the COFA, careers and dreams of people who'd had nothing to do with that flight. "Beth, what can I do? How can I help?" "Right now, the best thing you can do is cooperate fully with the investigation and avoid making any public statements about the incident. The media wants to turn this into a heroic narrative, but that's not helpful when we're trying to demonstrate that all proper procedures were followed." Sarah nodded, though she wondered how she was supposed to avoid public statements when reporters were calling her apartment and her workplace. "What about continuing my training? I'm supposed to take my check ride in 3 weeks. Beth was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah realized she'd stumbled into the conversation's most difficult territory. "Sarah, I think it would be best to postpone your check ride until after the investigation is complete." "You're grounding me?" "I'm suggesting that it would be prudent to wait until all the questions about that flight have been resolved. Taking your check ride while you're the subject of an FAA investigation would raise questions about our judgment as a training organization." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she forced them back. She'd known this was a possibility, but hearing it stated so directly still felt like a kick to the stomach. How long could that take? Investigations like this can take anywhere from a few weeks to several months, depending on what the FAA finds and whether any enforcement action is taken. Several months. Sarah had been planning to take her check ride, earn her private pilot certificate, and maybe start working on her instrument rating. Instead, she was facing an indefinite grounding while investigators tried to determine whether she'd been part of an unsafe training operation. "Beth, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course. Do you think I did anything wrong? Do you think I should have questioned Marcus's decision to climb to altitude?" Beth considered the question carefully before answering. "Sarah, Marcus Holloway has been instructing for 30 years. His safety record is impeccable, and his judgment has always been beyond reproach. If he felt you were ready for training at 10,000 feet, then I trust that assessment completely. But if his medical condition made altitude dangerous, then that's something he should have disclosed to his aviation medical examiner, not something a student pilot should be expected to recognize." Beth's voice carried conviction, but Sarah could hear the underlying worry. The responsibility for medical fitness rests with the pilot, not with their students or passengers. As Sarah left the flight school that afternoon, she passed the aircraft she'd been training in a different Cessna 172 than the one she'd landed at Sacramento Executive, but identical in every way that mattered. Another student was pre-flighting it for an afternoon lesson, going through the same ritual she'd performed dozens of times over the past months, but now the routine looked different to her, charged with potential dangers she'd never considered before. Every decision about altitude, weather, and destinations carried medical and safety implications that she was only beginning to understand. Flying had seemed like an escape from the controlled predictability of her laboratory work, but it was actually just a different kind of complexity with higher stakes and more variables. Her car radio was tuned to a talk radio station, and as she drove home, she caught the tail end of a discussion about general aviation safety. The host was interviewing a former airline pilot who was criticizing current flight training standards. "The problem is that we're putting students in situations they're not qualified to handle," the pilot was saying. This incident in Sacramento is a perfect example. Why was a 47-hour student pilot at 10,000 feet? That's the kind of altitude where you need to understand hypoxia, pressure differential effects, and emergency oxygen procedures. But the student pilot handled the emergency successfully, the host pointed out. This time, yes. But what about next time? What happens when a student pilot faces an emergency they can't handle because they've been put in a situation beyond their experience level? We're setting people up for failure, and sooner or later, someone's going to die. Sarah turned off the radio, unable to listen to any more speculation about her flight. But the pilot's words echoed in her mind as she sat in traffic on Highway 101. What about next time? What if she faced another emergency without Marcus there to guide her, even unconsciously? What if her 47 hours of training weren't enough for whatever the sky threw at her next? That evening, she called the hospital to check on Marcus's condition. The nurses reported that he was improving steadily, though he was still experiencing some confusion and memory gaps related to the hemorrhage. He was asking to see her, they said, but his doctors wanted to limit visitors until his condition stabilized. Further, she wanted to see him too, wanted to talk through what had happened and try to understand the decisions that had led to their crisis at 10,000 feet. But she also dreaded the conversation, afraid of what she might learn about the risks they'd unknowingly accepted when they'd climbed into the thin air above Sacramento Valley. Her laptop showed 47 new emails, most from reporters requesting interviews or aviation bloggers wanting to discuss the incident. She deleted them all without reading past the subject lines, but one message caught her attention. It was from Dr. James Chun, her father. "Sarah," the email read, "your mother and I saw the news report about your emergency landing. We're very proud of how you handled the situation, but we're also concerned about the safety of your flight training. Please call us when you're ready to talk." Her father's message was typically restrained, but she could read the subtext. Her parents had never been enthusiastic about her decision to learn to fly, and this incident would only confirm their belief that aviation was unnecessarily dangerous. They'd want her to quit training, to return to the safety of her laboratory job and abandon the dream that had led her into the sky in the first place. But as she stared at her reflection in her apartment window with the lights of San Francisco Bay twinkling beyond the glass, Sarah realized that quitting wasn't an option. Whatever questions the investigation raised, whatever criticism she faced from online pilots or talk radio hosts, she couldn't walk away from flying. The emergency landing at Sacramento Executive had been the most terrifying experience of her life, but it had also been proof that she belonged in a cockpit, that the skills Marcus had taught her were real and valuable. She opened a new email and began typing a response to a reporter's interview request. But instead of declining, she wrote something different. "I appreciate your interest in my story, but I think it's important that people understand this isn't just about one emergency landing. It's about the complex safety considerations involved in flight training, the responsibility that comes with being pilot in command, and the medical factors that can affect aviation safety. If you're interested in exploring those issues in depth, I'd be willing to talk with you." Before she could change her mind, she hit send. If her story was going to be told, she was going to make sure it was told completely, with all the difficult questions and uncomfortable realities that the feel-good news reports had ignored. Chapter 9. Deeper. Investigations Dr. Amanda Foster had been investigating aviation medical incidents for the NTSB for 12 years, but the case of Marcus Holloway and student pilot Sarah Chen presented a unique combination of factors that made it particularly intriguing. Sitting in her office in Washington, D.C., she reviewed the medical records, flight data, and witness statements that painted a picture of a routine training flight that had gone catastrophically wrong at precisely the wrong moment. The medical evidence was clear. Marcus had suffered a small subarachnoid hemorrhage caused by the rupture of a previously undetected cerebral aneurysm. The aneurysm itself was likely congenital, a weakness in a blood vessel wall that had existed for years without causing symptoms. But the timing of its rupture, occurring within minutes of reaching 10,000 feet, suggested a strong correlation with altitude exposure. Dr. Foster had seen similar cases before: pilots who'd suffered cardiovascular events at altitude, passengers who'd experienced medical emergencies during climb or descent, flight attendants who'd collapsed during rapid decompression events. The human body's response to altitude was complex and unpredictable, affected by factors ranging from genetics to fitness level to underlying medical conditions that might never manifest at sea level. But this case was different because of the people involved. Marcus Holloway wasn't a weekend warrior pilot pushing his limits in an experimental aircraft. He was a highly experienced flight instructor with 30 years of safe teaching. Sarah Chen wasn't a reckless student seeking thrills. She was a methodical, safety-conscious pilot who'd been following her instructor's guidance. Yet somehow, a routine training exercise had resulted in a medical emergency that could have killed both of them. Dr. Foster's phone rang, interrupting her review of the case file. The caller ID showed a Sacramento area code. "Dr. Foster, this is Dr. Sarah Patel at UC Davis Medical Center. I understand you're investigating the case of Marcus Holloway." "That's correct. I've reviewed the medical records you forwarded. Very thorough documentation." "Thank you. I'm calling because we've discovered some additional information that might be relevant to your investigation." Dr. Foster reached for her notepad. "What kind of information?" "We've completed a more detailed analysis of Mr. Holloway's medical history, including genetic testing and advanced imaging. It appears that he carries a genetic marker associated with connective tissue disorders, specifically a variant that affects collagen production in blood vessel walls. This was potentially significant. Genetic factors that affected vascular integrity could make someone more susceptible to aneurysm formation and rupture, especially under conditions of physiological stress." "How common is this genetic variant?" "It's present in approximately 3 to 5% of the population, but most people who carry it never develop clinical symptoms. However, when combined with other risk factors, family history, elevated blood pressure, exposure to altitude, it can significantly increase the risk of vascular events." "Was Mr. Holloway aware of this genetic predisposition?" "Not specifically. This type of testing isn't routinely performed unless there's a strong family history of aneurysms or other vascular abnormalities. His family history of stroke and cardiovascular disease should have been a red flag. But without genetic testing, there was no way to know about the additional risk factor." Dr. Foster made detailed notes as they spoke. If Marcus had carried a genetic predisposition to aneurysm formation that was unknown to both him and his aviation medical examiner, it raised serious questions about current medical certification standards. How many other pilots were flying with similar hidden risk factors? How many accidents or incidents might be prevented with more comprehensive medical screening? Dr. Patel, in your opinion, was the altitude exposure a significant factor in the timing of Mr. Holloway's hemorrhage? The current aviation medical examiner guidelines required basic cardiovascular screening, blood pressure checks, EKG testing for pilots over 40, and evaluation of family history. But they didn't include genetic testing, advanced imaging, or the kind of comprehensive vascular assessment that might have identified Marcus's risk factors. The question was whether that level of screening was practical or necessary for the general aviation community. Her computer chimed with an incoming email from the FAA's Flight Standards Division. Inspector Walsh had forwarded the complete case file from her investigation, including detailed interviews with Sarah Chen, statements from Golden Gate Aviation personnel, and analysis of the flight's radio communications and radar track. Reading through Sarah's statement, Dr. Foster was struck by the student pilot's clear recollection of events and her precise description of Marcus's symptoms. The sudden onset of severe headache, followed by epistaxis and loss of consciousness, was textbook for subarachnoid hemorrhage, but most lay people wouldn't recognize the significance of that symptom cluster. More interesting was Sarah's description of Marcus's brief period of semi-consciousness in the hospital, when he'd said, "Too high. Shouldn't have gone so high." Was that a coherent assessment of the situation, or just confused rambling from a brain injury patient? If Marcus had recognized, even subconsciously, that altitude was a risk factor for his condition, why had he chosen to climb to 10,000 feet on a routine training flight? Dr. Foster picked up her phone and dialed Inspector Walsh's direct number. "Janet, it's Amanda Foster at NTSB. I've been reviewing the Holloway case, and I have some questions about the training flight profile." "Sure. What do you need?" "I'm trying to understand the instructional purpose of the climb to 10,000 feet. Was this part of a planned lesson, or was it an impromptu decision?" According to Miss Chen, it was Holloway's idea. He wanted her to experience high-altitude performance and understand climb times for mountain flying. But here's what's interesting. I checked their training records, and there's no indication that high-altitude training was part of her curriculum at that stage. "What do you mean?" Sarah Chen was working toward her private pilot certificate, focusing on basic navigation and approach procedures. High-altitude training typically comes later, usually as part of instrument rating or commercial pilot training. For a student at her level, the normal training ceiling would be 3,000 to 5,000 feet. Dr. Foster felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. So Holloway was essentially conducting advanced training with a student who hadn't completed basic certification? That's one interpretation. The other possibility is that he was expanding her experience base in preparation for more challenging flights. Holloway was known for thorough training that prepared his students for real-world flying conditions. But real-world flying for a private pilot doesn't typically require operations at 10,000 feet. Exactly. Which raises the question of why an experienced instructor chose to expose a student pilot to altitude-related risks without a clear instructional justification. After the call, Dr. Foster created a new section in her case file, Training Decision Factors. If Marcus Holloway had made an uncharacteristic decision to climb to a potentially dangerous altitude without clear instructional purpose, there might be factors they hadn't yet identified. Medical issues affecting judgment, personal pressures, or external influences that had contributed to the chain of events. Her phone rang again. This time it was a call she'd been expecting from the FAA Civil Aerospace Medical Institute in Oklahoma City. "Dr. Foster, this is Dr. Michael Harrison at CAMI. We've completed our analysis of the Holloway case from an aeromedical perspective. What did you find?" "Several concerning factors. First, Holloway's medical certificate was issued based on incomplete family history information. His application listed cardiovascular disease for both parents, but didn't specify the details: his father's stroke at 58, his mother's hypertension and arterial disease. Would more specific information have changed his certification status? Possibly. With that family history, combined with his own elevated blood pressure, current guidelines would have required additional cardiovascular testing stress, EKG, echocardiogram, possibly cardiac catheterization. And if those tests had been performed, They might have revealed the aneurysm, or at least identified him as high risk for altitude-related medical events. Current policy would likely have resulted in a special issuance medical certificate with altitude restrictions. Dr. Foster made more notes. A special issuance certificate would have limited Marcus to operations below a specified altitude, typically 10,000 feet for cardiovascular conditions. If the medical certification system had worked as designed, the flight that led to his hemorrhage would never have been legally possible. Dr. Harrison, how many active pilots do you estimate might have similar undiagnosed risk factors? That's hard to quantify, but based on population genetics and known family history patterns, we're probably looking at thousands of pilots nationwide who carry elevated risks for altitude-related medical events. Thousands of pilots. Dr. Foster thought about the implications not just for aviation safety, but for the practical operation of the general aviation system. If comprehensive medical screening identified thousands of pilots as high risk for altitude operations, the economic and operational impact on the industry would be enormous. But the alternative, continuing with current standards and accepting periodic medical emergencies like Marcus Holloway's, raised its own set of ethical and safety questions. How many student pilots should be expected to handle instructor medical emergencies? How many emergency landings were acceptable costs for maintaining current certification standards? As Dr. Foster prepared her preliminary report for the NTSB board, she realized that the case of Marcus Holloway and Sarah Chen was about much more than one training flight gone wrong. It was a window into the complex balance between aviation safety, medical privacy, regulatory practicality, and the dreams of people who wanted nothing more than to slip the surly bonds of Earth and touch the face of the sky. The recommendations she made in her report could affect the flying careers of thousands of pilots, the economics of general aviation, and the safety of every person who chose to leave the ground in a small aircraft. It was a responsibility that weighed heavily on her shoulders as she began to write. The interview request Sarah had sent to Channel 7 resulted in something she hadn't expected. 30-minute documentary that aired during prime time on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after her emergency landing. Unlike the initial feel-good news report, this program took a deeper look at the complex issues surrounding aviation, medical certification, and flight training safety. Sarah sat in the television studio's makeup chair, having second thoughts about her decision to go public with the full story. The producer, Janet Morrison, had spent hours interviewing her about every aspect of the flight, from the decision to climb to 10,000 feet to her thoughts about current medical certification standards. It was going to be a very different kind of aviation story than what usually made it to television. 5 minutes to air, the floor director announced, and Sarah felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. She'd handled an in-flight emergency with relative composure, but the prospect of defending her decisions on television felt far more terrifying. The program opened with dramatic footage of aircraft in flight, but quickly shifted to serious discussion of aviation medical issues. Dr. Foster appeared via satellite from Washington, explaining the complexities of altitude-related medical emergencies. Dr. Patel discussed Marcus's condition and the genetic factors that had made him susceptible to hemorrhage. Inspector Walsh provided careful commentary about training standards and safety protocols. But the centerpiece of the program was Sarah's interview, conducted in the Golden Gate Aviation hangar, with aircraft visible in the background. She'd insisted on filming there, feeling that the aviation environment would help viewers understand the context of her decisions. "Sarah," Janet Morrison asked, "some critics have suggested that you should have questioned your instructor's decision to climb to 10,000 feet. How do you respond to that?" "I understand why people might think that," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But at 47 hours of flight time, I was still learning basic navigation and approach procedures. The idea that I should have overruled my instructor's medical assessment Based on knowledge I didn't possess, that seems unrealistic to me. But don't student pilots have a responsibility to recognize unsafe situations? Absolutely. We're taught to speak up if we see hazardous weather, mechanical problems, or violations of safety procedures. But medical certification is a specialized area that requires expertise most student pilots don't have. If we expect students to second-guess their instructor's medical fitness, we're essentially asking them to practice medicine without a license. The interview continued for 20 minutes, covering everything from her emergency procedures to her thoughts about the FAA investigation. Sarah found herself defending not just her own decisions, but the entire structure of flight training that relied on trust between students and instructors. The most difficult moment came when Morrison asked about Marcus's current condition. "He's recovering well," Sarah said, though her voice caught slightly. "The doctors expect him to make a full recovery, though it's unclear whether he'll be able to return to flight instruction. How does that make you feel?" "Responsible," Sarah said honestly. "Even though everyone tells me it wasn't my fault. I was the one at the controls when we climbed to the altitude that triggered his hemorrhage. I'll always wonder if there was something I could have done differently." The program concluded with a roundtable discussion featuring aviation medical experts, flight instructors, and safety advocates. The consensus was sobering. Current medical certification standards were inadequate for identifying pilots at risk for altitude-related medical events, but implementing more comprehensive screening would be expensive and potentially discriminatory. "The bottom line," said Dr. Richard Stone, a former FA flight surgeon, "is that we're balancing competing priorities: aviation safety, medical privacy, economic practicality, and individual rights. The Holloway case shows us that our current balance point might need adjustment." The documentary generated more reaction than Sarah had anticipated. Within hours of its broadcast, aviation forums and social media platforms were buzzing with discussion about medical certification reform, training standards, and the responsibilities of student pilots in emergency situations. Most of the response was supportive, but some criticism was harsh. A prominent aviation blogger wrote, "Sarah Chen is being hailed as a hero, but her decision to participate in high-altitude training as a low-time student shows poor judgment. This incident could have been prevented if she'd questioned her instructors." Decision-making. Another pilot posted, "We're setting a dangerous precedent when we encourage students to second-guess their instructors' medical decisions. Next thing you know, they'll be demanding to see our medical records before every flight." But the criticism was balanced by support from unexpected quarters. Airlines Pilots Association issued a statement praising Sarah's emergency handling and calling for comprehensive review of general aviation medical standards. The Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association published an editorial supporting improved medical screening. While defending current training practices, Sarah's phone had been ringing constantly since the program aired, but she'd stopped answering calls from numbers she didn't recognize. The attention was overwhelming, and she found herself hiding in her apartment, avoiding even routine trips to the grocery store where she might be recognized. 3 days after the documentary aired, she received a call that surprised her. "Sarah, this is Senator Patricia Williams' office. The senator chairs the Senate Aviation Subcommittee, and she'd like to invite you to testify at hearings on aviation medical certification reform." Sarah sat down heavily on her couch. Senate hearings, congressional testimony. Her emergency landing was escalating into a national policy debate. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to testify about policy issues," she said. "Senator Williams believes your experience provides valuable perspective on how medical certification standards affect real pilots in real situations. The hearings are scheduled for next month in Washington." After the call ended, Sarah realized that her life had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She was no longer just a student pilot who'd handled an emergency. She was becoming the public face of aviation medical reform. Whether she wanted that role or not, her phone rang again, and this time the caller ID showed Marcus's number. He'd been released from the hospital the week before and was recovering at home, though his doctors had grounded him indefinitely pending neurological evaluation. "Sarah, I saw the documentary. You did a good job explaining what happened. Thanks. I wasn't sure if I should have done it at all. I'm glad you did. People need to understand that this isn't about one flight or one emergency. It's about systemic issues that affect the entire aviation community." Sarah could hear fatigue in Marcus's voice, but also something else: determination, maybe, or resolve. "Marcus, how are you feeling about everything? The investigation, the media attention, the possibility that you might not be able to instruct again." "Honestly, I'm angry. Not at you, not at the FAA, but at the system that let this happen. I had a time bomb in my head for who knows how many years, and nobody had the tools to detect it. How many other instructors are flying with similar conditions? How many students are at risk because we're operating on incomplete medical information? Do you think the climb to 10,000 feet was a mistake?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "From a medical perspective, yes. If I'd known about my genetic predisposition and the aneurysm, I never would have made that decision. But I didn't know, and that's the real problem. The hearings, they want me to testify about medical certification reform." "Good. You should. Do it. You've got credibility that the rest of us don't have. You're not a career aviation person with industry ties or regulatory conflicts. You're someone who got caught up in a system failure and handled it with grace. I don't feel like I handled it with grace. I feel like I barely survived it. That's what grace looks like, sometimes not perfect performance, but doing what needs to be done when everything is falling apart." After the call, Sarah walked out onto her apartment balcony and looked up at the evening sky. Aircraft lights traced their familiar patterns overhead, each one carrying people who trusted that their pilots were medically fit to handle whatever challenges might arise during flight. But Marcus's case proved that trust might sometimes be misplaced through no fault of the pilots themselves. The next morning brought a certified letter from the FAA. Inspector Walsh's investigation had been completed, and the findings were summarized in a document that would become part of Sarah's permanent pilot record. The investigation concludes that the medical emergency experienced by certified flight instructor Marcus J. Holloway was caused by an undiagnosed medical condition that was not detectable through current aviation medical examiner protocols. Student pilot Sarah Chen responded to the emergency appropriately and demonstrated sound judgment throughout the event. No violations of federal aviation regulations were identified, and no enforcement action is recommended. Sarah read the conclusion 3 times, feeling a mixture of relief and anticlimax. No violations, no enforcement action. Her pilot certificate would not be affected, and she could resume training whenever she felt ready. But the letter also included a recommendation that would change everything. The investigation recommends that the Civil Aerospace Medical Institute review current medical certification standards for flight instructors, with particular attention to cardiovascular risk assessment and altitude restrictions for pilots with known genetic predispositions. Marcus's medical emergency was going to change how flight instructors were certified, how medical examinations were conducted, and how altitude-related risks were assessed. The ripple effects would touch thousands of pilots and reshape an industry that had operated under the same basic medical standards for decades. As Sarah prepared for her trip to Washington to testify before Congress, she realized that her emergency landing at Sacramento Executive had been just the beginning of a much longer journey. She'd wanted to learn to fly, but instead she'd become part of a national conversation about aviation safety, medical privacy, and the responsibilities that came with the privilege of flight. The student pilot, who'd frozen at 10,000 feet, was about to help rewrite the rules that governed how America's pilots were cleared to fly. The Hart Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C. was an intimidating maze of marble corridors and formal portraits that made Sarah feel like an imposter in her borrowed business suit. She'd flown to the Capitol the night before her first time as a passenger on a commercial flight since her emergency landing and spent a sleepless night in a downtown hotel reviewing her prepared statement. The Senate Aviation Subcommittee hearing room was smaller than she'd expected, but more formal than anything she'd experienced. Senators sat behind a curved wooden dais while witnesses testified from a table positioned below them, cameras capturing every word for television and internet broadcast. Senator Patricia Williams, the subcommittee chair, was a former airline pilot who'd spent 20 years flying for American Airlines before entering politics. Her introduction set the tone for the hearing. "We're here today because a routine training flight in California exposed fundamental flaws in how we assess pilot medical fitness. The fact that a student pilot had to save her instructor's life at 10,000 feet should trouble all of us." Dr. Foster testified first, presenting the NTSB's findings about Marcus's condition and the role altitude had played in triggering his hemorrhage. Her presentation was technical but clear, explaining how current medical certification standards had failed to identify a genetic predisposition that made Marcus susceptible to altitude-related medical events. How many pilots might have similar undiagnosed conditions? Senator Williams asked. Based on population genetics, we estimate between 3,000 and 5,000 currently certificated pilots carry genetic markers that significantly increase their risk of altitude-related cardiovascular events. Dr. Foster replied. The number sent a murmur through the hearing room. 5,000 pilots potentially at risk, operating under medical certificates that didn't account for their genetic predisposition. Dr. Harrison from the Civil Aerospace Medical Institute followed with testimony about current certification standards and the challenges of implementing more comprehensive screening. Genetic testing for all pilots would identify many at-risk individuals, he said, but it would also raise significant privacy concerns and could cost the industry millions of dollars annually. What's the alternative? Asked Senator Robert Chun, no relation to Sarah, the ranking minority member. Do we continue operating under standards that we know are inadequate? The alternative is accepting that some level of medical risk is inherent in aviation, just as it is in driving, working construction, or serving in the military. The question is what level of risk we're willing to accept. When Sarah's turn came to testify, her hands shook as she adjusted the microphone and looked up at the senators arrayed before her. She'd practiced her statement dozens of times, but the reality of addressing a congressional committee was more intimidating than anything she'd experienced in the cockpit. Senators, my name is Sarah Chen, and 3 months ago I was a student pilot with 47 hours of flight time. Today, I'm here because a routine training flight exposed me to an emergency I was barely qualified to handle and revealed gaps in our aviation medical system that put both instructors and students at unnecessary risk. She told her story simply and directly: the climb to 10,000 feet, Marcus's sudden collapse, the desperate radio calls at emergency landing. But she also tried to explain the human context that statistics couldn't capture. People assume that because I landed safely, everything worked out fine. But Marcus Holloway's flying career is probably over. He'll never know if he would have survived another 5 or 10 years of instruction if we'd stayed at a lower altitude. And I'll always wonder if I could have prevented what happened by questioning his decision to climb. Senator Williams leaned forward. Ms. Chun, do you believe student pilots should be expected to override their instructor's medical judgments? No, I don't. A student pilot with 47 hours doesn't have the medical knowledge to assess cardiovascular risks or genetic predispositions. But I do think instructors should have access to better medical information so they can make informed decisions about altitude exposure. What would that look like in practice? Sarah had thought about this question extensively. Maybe pilots with certain family histories or risk factors should undergo additional screening, genetic testing, advanced cardiac imaging, stress tests. And maybe there should be altitude restrictions for pilots with elevated risks, just like there are restrictions for pilots with other medical conditions. Senator Chen raised a concern that Sarah had anticipated. Wouldn't that kind of screening be discriminatory? Are we creating a two-tier system where some pilots face restrictions based on their genetics? Senator, we already have a tiered medical system. Airline pilots undergo more rigorous screening than private pilots. Pilots with diabetes face restrictions that others don't. The question isn't whether to have different standards for different people. It's whether our current standards adequately protect everyone who shares the airspace. The hearing continued for 3 hours with testimony from aviation medical experts, pilot organization representatives, and aircraft manufacturers. The emerging consensus was troubling. Current medical certification standards were based on 1950s medicine and didn't account for modern understanding of genetic risk factors, altitude physiology, or preventive screening techniques, but the solutions were complex and expensive. Comprehensive genetic screening for all pilots would cost an estimated $50 million annually and raise privacy concerns that had constitutional implications. Altitude restrictions for at-risk pilots would ground thousands of instructors and recreational pilots who posed minimal risk to others. During a break between witness panels, Senator Williams approached Sarah in the hallway outside the hearing room. Ms. Chen, I want to thank you for coming here today. I know this can't be easy, reliving that experience and being thrust into a policy debate you never asked to join. It's not easy, Sarah agreed, but it feels necessary. If Marcus's case can prevent other medical emergencies, then maybe something good can come from what happened. What are your plans now? Are you continuing with your flight training? Sarah had been dreading this question because she wasn't sure she knew the answer. I'm cleared to resume training, but I haven't decided whether I want to. Every time I think about climbing into a cockpit, I remember Marcus collapsing beside me. I'm not sure I trust myself to make good decisions under pressure. From everything I've heard, you made excellent decisions under the worst possible pressure. Don't let this experience convince you that you're not meant to fly. When the hearing resumed, the final panel included representatives from major pilot organizations, AOPA, ALPA, and the National Association of Flight Instructors. Their testimony revealed deep divisions within the aviation community about how to respond to the medical certification issues the Holloway case had exposed. We support enhanced medical screening, said the OPA representative, but we're concerned about the economic impact on recreational flying. Many pilots simply can't afford comprehensive genetic testing and advanced cardiac workups. The Flight Instructors Association took a different position. Our members are responsible for the safety of their students. We need better tools to assess medical risks, even if it means more expensive and complex certification requirements. ALPA, representing airline pilots, supported the most comprehensive reforms. Our members already undergo extensive medical screening every 6 months. There's no reason general aviation pilots shouldn't have access to the same level of medical assessment, especially if they're carrying passengers or providing instruction. As the hearing concluded, Senator Williams announced that the subcommittee would be drafting legislation to modernize aviation medical certification standards. The bill would require genetic screening for pilots with certain family histories, mandate altitude restrictions for those with elevated cardiovascular risks, and provide federal funding to make enhanced screening accessible to recreational pilots. The status quo is unacceptable, she said. We can't continue operating under medical standards that we know are inadequate, and we can't expect student pilots to handle medical emergencies that could be prevented with better screening. Flying back to San Francisco that evening, Sarah looked out the airliner's window at the lights of cities passing below and thought about all the small aircraft navigating the same airways. Some of those pilots were probably carrying genetic time bombs, like the one that had nearly killed Marcus. Others might be students like herself, working with instructors whose medical fitness was based on incomplete information. The legislation Senator Williams was proposing would change that, but it would also change the fundamental character of general aviation. Flying would become more expensive, more regulated, more medicalized. Some people who dreamed of becoming pilots would be grounded before they ever had a chance to solo. But other students like herself, instructors like Marcus would be protected from medical emergencies that current standards couldn't prevent. The sky would be safer, even if it was less accessible. As the airliner descended towards San Francisco International Airport, Sarah made a decision that surprised her. She was going to complete her flight training. Not because the investigation had cleared her of wrongdoing, and not because senators had praised her emergency handling, but because she owed it to Marcus to prove that his teaching had been worthwhile. The student pilot who'd frozen at 10,000 feet was going to become a certificated pilot, and someday she might even become an instructor herself. When that day came, she'd have access to medical screening tools that could prevent the kind of emergency that had changed both their lives. It was a small victory in a complex battle, but it felt like the right place to start. 6 weeks after testifying before Congress, Sarah walked into Golden Gate Aviation for her first flight since the emergency landing. The familiar smells of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid, the sounds of aircraft engines starting up on the ramp, the sight of students and instructors briefing their flights, all of it felt simultaneously comforting and alien, like returning to a childhood home that had somehow grown smaller and more fragile. Beth Martinez met her at the scheduling desk with a smile that didn't quite hide her concern. "Welcome back, Sarah. Ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Sarah replied, though the statement felt more like a question than a declaration. Her new instructor was Jennifer Walsh, a former airline pilot who'd returned to teaching after taking early retirement from United Airlines. At 52, Jennifer had logged over 15,000 hours in everything from Cessna 152s to Boeing 777s, and her reputation for patient, thorough instruction had made her the obvious choice to help Sarah work through whatever psychological barriers the emergency might have created. "First flight back is always the hardest," Jennifer said as they walked toward the aircraft. "We're going to take it slow, stay local, and just focus on getting comfortable in the cockpit again." The aircraft was a different Cessna 172 than the one Sarah had been training in before. This one was newer, with updated avionics and a slightly different panel layout. But the fundamental controls were identical, and as she settled into the left seat and ran through her pre-flight checks, muscle memory began to override anxiety. "How does it feel?" Jennifer asked as Sarah completed her cockpit familiarization. "Strange. Like I'm playing a role I used to know how to perform." Sarah reached for the mixture control, then paused. "Jennifer, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think I should have questioned Marcus's decision to climb to 10,000 feet?" Jennifer was quiet for a moment, considering her answer carefully. "Sarah, I've read the entire case file, including the FAA investigation and the NTSB report. From everything I can see, you responded appropriately to your instructor's requests and handled the emergency with exceptional skill." "That's not what I asked." "No, it's not." Jennifer turned in her seat to face Sarah directly. "Here's what I think. At 47 hours, with Marcus Holloway as your instructor, questioning his decision would have shown either remarkable insight or dangerous arrogance. Most students in your position would have trusted their instructor's judgment completely. But if I'd spoken up, you might have prevented the medical emergency, or you might have interfered with legitimate training that Marcus felt you were ready for. The problem isn't that you trusted your instructor. The problem is that the medical certification system didn't give him the information he needed to make an informed decision." They spent the next hour flying gentle patterns around the Palo Alto practice area, working on basic maneuvers that Sarah had mastered months earlier. But everything felt different, now not harder, exactly, but charged with new awareness of how quickly routine flights could become emergem all there is. 3 months earlier, Sarah Chen had walked into Golden Gate Aviation with a dream that felt both impossible and inevitable. The flight school occupied a modest building on the edge of Palo Alto Airport, its walls covered with faded photographs of student pilots posing proudly next to small aircraft, their faces glowing with the unique satisfaction that came from conquering the sky. She'd saved for 2 years to afford flight training, working double shifts at the biotech startup where she managed laboratory equipment contracts. Every dollar that didn't go to rent or food went into the flying fund, a coffee can she kept. On her kitchen counter, watching it slowly fill with crumpled bills and loose change. Her friends thought she was crazy. A 26-year-old lab manager with a perfectly stable career didn't just decide to become a pilot. But Sarah had been dreaming of flying since she was 8 years old, watching planes take off from SFO during family trips to see her grandmother in Daly City. Her father, Dr. James Chun, had been less than supportive. "Flying is dangerous," he'd said over dinner at their monthly family gathering in Chinatown. "You have a good job, steady income. Why risk it for something so impractical?" Her mother, Maria, had been more diplomatic but equally concerned. They were first-generation immigrants who'd built their success on careful planning and risk aversion. Their daughter's sudden desire to take to the air felt like a betrayal of everything they'd worked to achieve. But Sarah had inherited her father's stubbornness along with his analytical mind. She'd researched flight schools for months before choosing Golden Gate Aviation, drawn by their reputation for thorough training and their fleet of well-maintained aircraft. The school's chief flight instructor, Marcus Holloway, had a legendary reputation among Bay Area pilots. He'd trained over 400 students in his 3 decades of teaching, with a safety record that was spotless. Marcus was 54 years old, weathered by sun and wind from countless hours in open cockpits during his early years as a crop duster in Nebraska. He'd come to California in the early 90s, drawn by the year-round flying weather and the steady stream of tech workers with disposable income who wanted to learn to fly. He was known for his patience with nervous students, his encyclopedic knowledge of aviation regulations, and his ability to teach landings to pilots who seemed destined to never get it right. Their first meeting had been intimidating. Marcus sat behind a metal desk in the flight school's cramped office, Sarah's completed application spread out in front of him like evidence in a trial. He'd studied her background bachelor's degree in biochemistry, 5 years of work experience, number previous aviation training, with the kind of attention most people reserve for tax documents. "Why do you want to fly?" he'd asked, not looking up from her paperwork. Sarah had prepared for this question, but his directness still caught her off guard. "I've always wanted to," she said, immediately recognizing how inadequate that sounded. Marcus finally looked up, his gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel like he could see through her skull into her thoughts. "That's not an answer. That's an excuse. People want lots of things they never do. Why flying? Why?" Now, she'd taken a breath, trying to organize thoughts that had been swirling in her head for months. "I work in a lab. Everything is controlled, predictable, safe. I follow protocols, maintain equipment, process samples. It's good work, important work, but..." She paused, searching for words. "I want to do something that requires everything I have. Something where I can't just follow a checklist and expect it to work out. I want to be responsible for something that matters." Marcus had nodded slowly. "Flying matters, all right. It matters enough to kill you if you don't respect it. You understand that?" "I understand that." "Do you?" "Because I've had students who thought they understood it right up until they found themselves in a cloud with no instruments, or trying to land in a crosswind that was beyond their skill level. Understanding and knowing are different things. Sarah had met his gaze steadily. Then teach me the difference. That had been the beginning of a relationship that was part teacher-student, part father-daughter, and part drill sergeant-recruit. Marcus didn't believe in building confidence through false praise. He believed in building competence through relentless practice and honest assessment. Their first flight had been a disaster by most standards. Sarah had over-controlled everything, fought the aircraft instead of flying it, and landed with enough bounces to make the other instructors look up from their pre-flight inspections. Flying isn't like driving a car, Marcus had told her after they'd shut down the engine. A car forgives your mistakes. An airplane doesn't forgive anything. But he'd scheduled her next lesson anyway, and the one after that. Week by week, hour by hour, she'd begun to understand what he meant about the difference between understanding and knowing. The knowledge came in layers first, the mechanical understanding of how lift and thrust overcame weight and drag. Then the practical understanding of how to make the aircraft do what she wanted. And finally the intuitive understanding that let her feel what the airplane was trying to tell her through the controls. Her parents had attended her first solo flight, 3 months after she'd started training. Marcus had sent them up in a school aircraft with another instructor to watch from above as Sarah took off alone for the first time. She'd made 3 trips around the pattern, each landing better than the last. And when she'd finally shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit, she'd understood why pilots called it the ultimate high. She was alone in an aircraft, responsible for her own life and the lives of anyone she might carry in the future. Her father had been quiet during the drive home that day, but as they pulled into her apartment complex, he'd turned to her with something that might have been pride in his eyes. "You look natural up there," he'd said. "Like you belonged." That had been 2 months ago. Since then, she'd logged another 30 hours, working through the requirements for her private pilot certificate. Cross-country flights to Monterey and Lake Tahoe, night flying over the glittering lights of San Francisco Bay, instrument training. Under the hood, learning to trust her gauges when her eyes couldn't be trusted. Marcus had pushed her harder as her skills developed, introducing emergency procedures that made her heart race even in the safety of the practice area. Engine failures, electrical fires, lost communications, all of it practiced until her responses became automatic. But they'd never practiced what to do when the instructor became the emergency. Now, at 10,000 feet with Marcus unconscious beside her, Sarah realized that some emergencies couldn't be practiced. They could only be survived. The morning of what would become the longest day of Sarah's life had started with perfect flying weather. High pressure had settled over Northern California, bringing unlimited visibility and light winds, the kind of conditions that made pilots forget why they'd spent so much money on instrument ratings they hoped never to use. Sarah had arrived at the airport early, as was her habit, to pre-flight the aircraft they'd be flying. Cessna 739ER was one of the school's newer trainers, a 1998 172R, with a reliable Lycoming engine and modern avionics that made navigation almost too easy. She'd flown this particular aircraft 16 times before, knew its quirks and characteristics. Like those of an old friend, the pre-flight inspection had revealed nothing unusual. Oil level good, fuel tanks full, control surfaces moving freely. She'd checked the weather, filed their flight plan to Sacramento Executive, and reviewed the approach charts for their destination. Marcus liked his students to be prepared for every phase of flight before they left the ground. He'd arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, coffee in hand and flight bags slung over his shoulder. At 54, Marcus still moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. His hair had gone completely gray in the years since Sarah had started training with him, but his hands remained steady and his mind sharp as ever, ready to work on some radio navigation. He'd asked, settling into the right seat as Sarah completed her engine start checklist. "Ready," she'd replied, though they both knew that readiness in aviation was always relative. Every flight brought new challenges, new lessons, new ways for the sky to test your skills and judgment. The flight to Sacramento had been routine until they weren't. They'd climbed to 5,500 feet for the trip eastbound, the Bay Area falling away. Beneath them in a patchwork of urban sprawl and farmland. Marcus had her practice intercepting and tracking VOR radials, the old-school navigation technique that predated GPS by decades, but remained a required skill for the private pilot certificate. Technology fails, he'd explained as she turned to intercept the Stockton VOR. GPS goes down, your panel display craps out. Then what? You better know how to get home using the old ways. She'd been getting good at it, finding the subtle corrections needed to track a radio precisely, when Marcus had asked for a climb to 10,000 feet. "Let's see how she handles up there," he'd said. "You'll want to know how long it takes to climb to altitude if you ever fly cross-country through the mountains." The climb had taken 12 minutes, the engine working harder in the thinner air but performing normally. At 10,000 feet, the world spread out below them like a relief map, the Sierra Nevada visible as a jagged line on the eastern horizon. Sarah had never flown this high before, and the perspective was intoxicating. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Marcus had said, and she'd turned to agree with him. That's when she'd seen his face go pale. It happened fast. One moment he was looking out at the mountains, the next he was pressing his hand to his forehead, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "Marcus, you okay?" "Just a headache," he'd said, but his voice was tight with something that might have been pain or confusion. Came on suddenly. Sarah had started to suggest they head back to Palo Alto when the blood started flowing from his nose. Not a trickle, a steady stream that soaked into his shirt and dripped onto the chart spread across his lap. "Marcus." She'd reached for him as he slumped forward, his head dropping toward his chest like a marionette with cut strings. That's when panic had set in. Real panic, the kind that made thinking impossible and turned her hands into useless claws that fumbled with controls she'd operated hundreds of times before. The aircraft had started a gentle left turn as she'd tried to shake Marcus awake, and it had taken all her concentration to level the wings and maintain altitude. The radio call to Oakland Center had been purely instinctive, drilled into her by months of emergency training. Declare the emergency, state your intentions, follow instructions. But Marcus had never covered what to do when the person giving instructions was unconscious in the seat beside you. Cessna 739ER, Oakland Center. I'm showing you 40 miles northeast of Sacramento Executive. Are you familiar with that airport? Sarah keyed the mic, trying to keep her voice steady. Negative, I've never been there. My instructor was going to take me through the approach. A pause, then a different voice came on the frequency. Older, more authoritative. 739EA, this is Oakland Center Supervisor. I'm going to have you work with approach control at Sacramento. They'll vector you for an approach to executive. Can you maintain altitude and heading? Yes, I can maintain altitude and heading. She could barely. The aircraft wanted to climb in the thermals rising from the sun-baked ground below, and she found herself constantly adjusting trim and power to hold 10,000 feet. Roger, what's the condition of your instructor? Sarah looked at Marcus again. His breathing was regular but shallow, and the bleeding from his nose had slowed to an occasional drip. His face was pale, almost gray, and he showed no response when she spoke his name or shook his shoulder. He's unconscious, bleeding from the nose, started about 5 minutes ago with a sudden headache. Copy that. 739ER. Contact Sacramento approach on 119.2. Tell them you're the emergency aircraft with an unconscious instructor. They're expecting you. Her hand shook as she reached for the radio to change frequencies. 119.2. She'd never talked to Sacramento. Approach before, had no idea what to expect. At Palo Alto, She knew all the controllers by voice, knew their habits and personalities. Here, she was just another voice on the frequency, except this voice belonged to a student pilot in over her head. Sacramento approach. Cessna 739ER with you at 10,000. 739ER, Sacramento approach. Radar contact 40 miles northeast of Sacramento. Executive. We have your emergency information from Oakland Center. How are you doing up there? The controller's voice was calm, professional, but she could hear something else underneath it: concern, maybe, or the special attention that came with handling an emergency. How was she doing? She was terrified, confused, and fighting to keep from hyperventilating. But that wasn't what he needed to hear. The story begins on what seemed like a perfect morning for flying. Sarah Chen, a dedicated student pilot with 47 hours of flight time, arrived at Golden Gate Aviation in Palo Alto for what was supposed to be routine cross-country training. The California sky was clear, the winds were calm, and her instructor, Marcus Holloway, a seasoned pilot with decades of experience, was preparing for another standard lesson. Marcus was the kind of instructor every student pilot hoped for: patient, methodical, and deeply committed to safety. He had built his reputation on thorough preparation and conservative decision-making, never pushing students beyond their capabilities. Sarah had been flying with him for months, steadily building her skills and confidence under his careful guidance. Their plan was straightforward: a cross-country flight from Palo Alto to Sacramento Executive Airport for approach practice. It was exactly the kind of training flight that would help Sarah build the experience she needed for her private pilot certificate. They completed their pre-flight inspection together, reviewed weather conditions, filed their flight plan, and prepared for what both expected to be an educational and uneventful journey. As they climbed into the familiar Cessna 172 tail number 739ER, neither Sarah nor Marcus could have imagined that this routine training flight would become a fight for survival that would ultimately change aviation safety protocols forever. The early portion of the flight proceeded exactly as planned. Sarah handled the takeoff smoothly, established their course toward Sacramento, and settled into the rhythm of cross-country flying. The aircraft climbed steadily through the clear morning air, with Marcus providing his usual calm commentary about navigation, radio procedures, and situational awareness. But then Marcus made an unusual request. Instead of maintaining their planned altitude of 5,500 feet, he asked Sarah to climb to 10,000 feet. His reasoning seemed sound at the time. He wanted her to experience how the aircraft handled at higher altitudes, knowledge that would be valuable for future cross-country flights through mountainous terrain. Sarah complied without hesitation. Marcus was her instructor, and she trusted his judgment completely. The Cessna climbed steadily toward 10,000 feet, the engine performing normally and all systems operating within acceptable parameters. From her perspective, it was simply another learning opportunity. What neither of them knew was that Marcus had been living with a ticking time bomb in his cardiovascular system. An undiagnosed cerebral aneurysm, a weakened, bulging area in a brain artery, had been developing silently for months or even years. The reduced atmospheric pressure at 10,000 feet, combined with the physical stress of flight instruction, created the perfect conditions for disaster. At exactly 10,000 feet, Marcus suddenly complained of an intense headache. Before Sarah could react, blood began flowing from his nose, and within moments, he had lost consciousness completely. Her instructor, her safety net, her mentor, her lifeline, was slumped in the right seat, unresponsive and bleeding. In an instant, Sarah Chen went from being a student pilot on a routine training flight to being the sole conscious person aboard an aircraft flying at 10,000 feet. The magnitude of her situation hit her like a physical blow. She was alone, responsible not only for her own survival, but for that of her unconscious instructor, flying an aircraft she was still learning to master. Her first instinct was panic, but her training kicked in almost immediately. Marcus had drilled emergency procedures into her from her earliest lessons, emphasizing that the most important thing in any crisis was to continue flying the airplane. Aviate, navigate, communicate, the fundamental priorities of emergency management that every pilot learns. She maintained control of the aircraft while trying desperately to wake Marcus, shaking his shoulder and calling his name. But he remained completely unresponsive, his breathing shallow but regular, blood continuing to seep from his nose. The reality was undeniable. She was on her own. With trembling hands, Sarah reached for the radio. She had practiced emergency communications and training, but those had been simulated scenarios with Marcus beside her, ready to take control if needed. This was terrifyingly real. She tuned to emergency frequency and transmitted the words that would mark the beginning of her fight for survival. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Cessna 739 AIA. Student pilot, instructor unconscious, requesting immediate assistance. The response came immediately from Sacramento Approach Control. The controller's voice was calm, professional, and reassuring, exactly what Sarah needed to hear in her moment of crisis. He quickly assessed her situation, gathering essential information about her experience level, the aircraft's condition, and her instructor's status. More importantly, he began the process of talking her through the emergency. The controller understood that he wasn't just managing aircraft separation and approach sequences. He was literally talking a student pilot through the most challenging situation of her aviation career. His calm demeanor and clear instructions became Sarah's lifeline, the steady voice that would guide her through the next crucial minutes. He immediately declared her emergency traffic, giving her priority handling and clearing other aircraft out of her path. But beyond the technical aspects of air traffic control, he provided something even more valuable: confidence. His matter-of-fact approach to her situation helped Sarah begin to believe that survival was possible, that her training might actually be sufficient to handle this crisis. The controller's decision to vector her to Sacramento Executive Airport, rather than attempting a return to Palo Alto, was crucial. Executive had a longer runway and better emergency facilities, providing the margin for error that a student pilot in crisis desperately needed. Most importantly, it was directly ahead of her current position, minimizing the complex navigation that might overwhelm someone in her situation. As Sarah began her approach to Sacramento Executive Airport, every mile felt like an eternity. The controller guided her through each step, providing headings, altitudes, and reassurance in measured doses. He understood that too much information would overwhelm her, while too little would leave her feeling abandoned in the sky. The sight of the airport emerging from the urban sprawl ahead was both relief and terror. Relief because it represented safety and the end of her ordeal, but terror because she still had to execute a landing, something she had done dozens of times in training. But never under these conditions, never at an unfamiliar airport, never. With emergency vehicles waiting on the ground. The approach required every skill Marcus had taught her over months of training. She had to manage power settings, maintain proper airspeed, track the runway centerline, and execute a dozen other tasks while fighting the overwhelming urge to rush or over-control the aircraft. The controller's guidance was invaluable, but ultimately, the landing would depend on her ability to execute the fundamentals she had learned. As she descended through 3,000 feet, then 2,000, then 1,000, the runway grew larger in her windscreen. She could see the emergency vehicles positioned alongside the runway: red fire trucks, white ambulances, and operations vehicles all standing by for her arrival. The sight was both comforting and terrifying, a reminder that while help was waiting, everyone expected this to be a difficult landing. At 500 feet above the ground, Sarah made the final configuration changes, following the approach checklist from memory. The runway filled her windscreen, the painted numbers 2 to 0, clearly visible on the threshold. This was the moment when months of training would either prove sufficient or fall tragically short. The landing, when it came, was far from perfect, but absolutely adequate. Sarah's main wheels touched the runway with a firm thump, and she immediately applied the techniques Marcus had drilled into her. Back pressure on the yoke to keep the nose wheel off initially, then letting the aircraft slow naturally as it rolled. Down the 5,000-foot runway. "Nice landing, 739ER, came the controller's voice, and she could hear genuine relief in his tone. She had done it. Against all odds, with only 47 hours of flight experience, she had successfully executed an emergency landing that saved both her life and her instructor's. But even as the aircraft rolled to a stop and the emergency vehicles swarmed around them, Sarah knew this was far from over. Marcus remained unconscious, his condition unknown and potentially critical. The successful landing was just the first step in what would become a much larger story about aviation safety, medical screening, and the hidden dangers that can lurk. In even the most routine training flights, the paramedics worked quickly to extract Marcus from the aircraft. Their professional efficiency, a stark contrast to the chaos Sarah felt in her own mind. She had accomplished something extraordinary, but the full magnitude of what had happened and what it would mean for the future of aviation training was only beginning to become clear in the days and weeks following the emergency landing. Investigators from the NTSB, FAA, and medical professionals began piecing together what had happened aboard Cessna 739A. The initial focus was on the aircraft itself. Was there a mechanical failure, a problem with the pressurization system, or some other technical issue that had caused Marcus's collapse? But the aircraft checked out perfectly. Every system had functioned normally. Every component was within specifications. The investigators' attention turned to medical factors, and what they discovered was both shocking and revealing about gaps. In the aviation medical certification system, Marcus Holloway, despite holding a valid medical certificate, had been living with a significant cerebral aneurysm, a weakness in a brain artery that could rupture under stress. The condition was completely asymptomatic until the moment of rupture, but it had been developing for an unknown period of time. Worse, the medical examination required for his flight instructor certificate had failed to detect any warning signs. The altitude change from 5,500 to 10,000 feet had created the perfect storm of conditions for the aneurysm to rupture. The reduced atmospheric pressure, combined with the physical and mental stress of flight instruction, had triggered a medical emergency that could have been fatal for both instructor and student. The investigation revealed that Marcus's case was not isolated. The medical certification system for pilots and flight instructors relied heavily on self-reporting and basic examinations that might miss serious underlying conditions. There was no requirement for specialized cardiovascular screening, no protocols for assessing the risks of high-altitude flight for instructors with potential medical issues. Sarah Chen could have simply moved on with her life after the emergency landing. She completed her private pilot certificate, earned her commercial license, and became a flight instructor herself. But the experience had fundamentally changed her perspective on aviation safety, and she felt a responsibility to ensure that other pilots and instructors wouldn't face the same risks. Working with investigators, medical professionals, and aviation safety advocates, Sarah began pushing for comprehensive reforms in pilot medical certification. Her story became a powerful case study in how seemingly minor gaps in safety protocols could lead to life-threatening situations. The resistance to change was significant. Enhanced medical screening would be expensive, potentially excluding qualified pilots from careers they loved. Some argued that the statistical risk was too low to justify major systemic changes. But Sarah's experience and the investigation into Marcus's condition provided compelling evidence that the current system was inadequate. Senator Williams, chair of the Aviation Subcommittee, became a champion of reform after hearing Sarah's testimony. The legislation that eventually passed required enhanced cardiovascular screening for all commercial pilots and flight instructors, particularly those who routinely flew at altitudes above 8,000 feet. The new protocols would have detected Marcus's aneurysm months before it became life-threatening. 18 months after her emergency landing, Sarah Chen stood on the ramp at Golden Gate Aviation as a certified flight instructor, watching her own student prepare for a cross-country flight. The symmetry of the moment wasn't lost on her. She was now in Marcus's former role, responsible for another young pilot's safety and development. But the world of flight training had changed significantly. The enhanced medical protocols had already identified and prevented 3 potential medical emergencies in the previous quarter. Instructors with cardiovascular risk factors were either treated, monitored more closely, or restricted to lower altitude operations. The changes were saving lives, but they had come at a cost. Marcus Holloway had attempted to return to flight instruction after his recovery, but the comprehensive medical evaluation required under the new protocols revealed not only the treated aneurysm but also early signs of arterial disease that posed ongoing risks at altitude. His medical certificate for instruction was permanently revoked, though he was cleared for recreational flying below 5,000 feet. The loss of his instructing privileges was devastating for someone who had defined himself by his ability to teach others to fly. But Marcus adapted with characteristic grace, becoming the school's ground instructor and teaching weather interpretation and regulatory knowledge to new students. His experience and wisdom continued to benefit student pilots, even if he could no longer take them into the sky. As a flight instructor, Sarah developed her own teaching philosophy, heavily influenced by Marcus's methods, but shaped by her unique experience. She never took students above 8,000 feet without specific high-altitude training and comprehensive medical briefings. She used her own story as a teaching tool, helping students understand that aviation safety wasn't just about individual decision-making, but about systems working together to minimize risk. Her article in Flying Magazine about altitude training protocols was controversial in some circles, but compelling in its data. The new medical standards were already showing results, and Sarah had become a recognized voice in aviation safety advocacy. When Senator Williams' office called about participating in a documentary on aviation safety reform, she didn't hesitate to agree. Every student pilot Sarah taught heard her story not as a tale of heroism, but as a lesson in preparedness, system thinking, and the importance of comprehensive safety protocols. She emphasized that her successful emergency landing was as much about luck and adequate training as it was about individual skill. The most important lesson, she always told her students, was that aviation safety wasn't just about pilots making good decisions in the moment. It was about systems medical certification, training protocols, emergency procedures that worked together to minimize risk. When those systems failed, as they had on that day over Sacramento, pilots needed to be prepared to handle situations they had never trained for. 2 years after the emergency landing, the ripple effects of Sarah's experience continued to spread through the aviation community. The FAA had incorporated her story into the training program for aviation medical examiners, using it as a case study in the importance of comprehensive cardiovascular screening. The new protocols had been adopted internationally, influencing medical certification standards in multiple countries, but perhaps more importantly, the culture of aviation safety had shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. Instructors were more aware of medical risks, students were better educated about emergency procedures, and the entire system had become more robust in identifying and managing potential hazards before they became crises. Marcus Holloway, now working as a ground instructor, took pride in the changes his experience had helped bring about. The loss of his flight instruction privileges had been painful, but knowing that other instructors and students were safer because of what had happened. To him provided a measure of peace. He and Sarah had developed a practice of co-teaching emergency procedures, using their shared experience to help students understand both the technical and psychological aspects of crisis management. Sarah's phone still buzzed regularly with calls from researchers, safety advocates, and other pilots who wanted to understand how a student pilot with only 47 hours had managed to save 2 lives in an unprecedented emergency. But she always brought the conversation back to systems and preparation rather than individual heroism. When the documentary about aviation safety reform premiered, Sarah's story formed the centerpiece of a larger narrative about how the aviation industry continuously evolves to address new understanding of risk. The film showed how a single terrifying experience had catalyzed changes that would protect thousands of future pilots and passengers. The documentary also highlighted the personal costs of safety reform. Marcus's story, his dedication to teaching, his medical crisis, and his adaptation to new limitations, reminded viewers that safety improvements often came at significant personal sacrifice for those who experienced the original tragedies. The film also celebrated the positive outcomes. Statistics showed measurably improved safety in flight training, fewer medical emergencies at altitude, and better preparation of pilots for crisis situations. Sarah's emergency landing had become more than a survival story. It had become a catalyst for systemic improvement in aviation safety. Years later, Sarah Chen continued to find herself looking up at the sky with the same mixture of wonder and respect that had first drawn her to aviation. But her perspective had been forever changed by those terrifying minutes over Sacramento. The sky was no longer just a realm of freedom and possibility. It was also a place where preparation, training, and systematic safety thinking could mean the difference between life and death. As she watched each new student pilot take their first solo flight, Sarah felt the familiar combination of pride and worry that came with sending someone off alone into that vast blue expanse. But she also felt confidence in the knowledge that they were better prepared than she had been, protected by safety protocols that existed because of what she and Marcus had experienced. The story of Cessna 739ER had become part of aviation lore, not just as a tale of survival against odds, but as a reminder that in aviation, as in life, our greatest challenges often become the foundation for our most meaningful contributions to the safety and well-being of others. Sarah's journey from terrified student pilot to accomplished instructor and safety advocate demonstrated that sometimes the sky tests us, not just to see if we can survive, but to see what we'll do with the knowledge that survival brings. In her case, that knowledge had made the sky safer for everyone who came after her. The endless blue sky still called to every pilot who had ever dreamed of leaving the ground. But thanks to the changes initiated by one student pilot's extraordinary emergency landing, more of them would answer that call and return safely home. If this incredible story of courage, determination, and the pursuit of flight safety moved you, inspired you, or kept you on the edge of your seat, we'd be incredibly grateful if you'd take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps other story lovers find content like this and tells us you want more incredible aviation tales. Subscribe to our channel. We have many more epic stories waiting to be told, from miraculous aviation rescues to tales of human determination against impossible odds. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest story adventures and are the first to experience our newest tales of courage and survival. Share this with someone who appreciates great storytelling, has an interest in aviation, or could be inspired by Sarah's incredible journey from student pilot to safety advocate. Your factor support means everything to us and helps ensure we can continue bringing you these powerful true stories of human courage and the lessons they teach us all. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community.